So how do we deal with mental health stigma? Find out today on this episode of IncreMental Health Tips. Hi, welcome to IncreMental Health Tips. My name is Jared. As always, I'm joined with my co-host Liz. Today we're discussing a really important issue about stigma and mental health. Now, just to begin, according to Johns Hopkins, mental health disorders account for several of the top causes of disability in established market economies such as the United States and globally. These issues that people often face are major depression, manic depression, schizophrenia, obsessive compulsive disorder, and etc. An estimated 26% of Americans aged 18 and older, or about 1 in 4 adults, suffers from a diagnosable mental disorder in a given year. Many people suffer from more than one mental disorder at a time. In particular, depressive illness tends to co-occur with substance abuse and anxiety disorders. Just a couple more here. Approximately 9.5% of American adults ages 18 and over will suffer from a depressive illness each year. And finally, approximately 18% of people ages 18 to 54 in a given year will have an anxiety disorder, including panic disorders, obsessive compulsive disorders, post-traumatic stress disorders, generalized anxiety disorders, and phobias, including social phobias, agoraphobia, and other specific phobias. So, Liz, mental illness is very common. So why is this so stigmatized in society?
I think in a lot of cases when people think of mental health disorders, they're thinking of the most extreme cases that they can think of, whereas there's probably someone else who has the same disorder that they know who's managing it well and they don't even know that the person has it. There can also be a lot of misunderstandings around mental health and when someone should seek help.
Which is a really important point. We do have a lot of misconceptions going around about mental health. Oftentimes, people associate their mental illness with their identity. Just thinking of an example, a professor that you and I both have had, who is a psychologist, has often told the story that when she first got her license as a psychologist, and she would introduce herself or tell people what she does, people would immediately respond with, "Oh, my name is Bill, and I have depression," or they would just sort of immediately after their name mention the mental illness or the mental health issue that they are experiencing. And this was really quite something for this professor, because she mentioned that, well, but that's not who you are. Tell me about you, who you are. But the truth is, and granted, people are telling her this because of who she is and what she does for a living, but I think it is a really good illustration of how people sort of define themselves by their mental illness or the issues that they're facing rather than who they actually are.
Yeah, I do think that people can often make that connection where they over associate their mental health with their identity. And I think it's important to realize that mental health is part of our regular health. Just like someone who has cancer has impaired health, someone who has a mental health issue can have impaired health. The two things really aren't that different. Both require treatment, and, they aren't necessarily the person's fault. So it's important to realize that mental health is just a part of regular health.
Well, that is true. I mean, in my undergraduate degree, I took a lot of health courses, and we talked about how health is really health is a lot of things. There are a lot of contributing aspects to health, including biological things. Obviously, that's what you typically think of, but there's also psychological components, and there's also social components. Even your personal circumstances and kind of your situation in life can actually impact your health too. So health is really so much more than our physiological state, and that's a really important point. And
yeah, so when I was in school, we talked about a categorical approach or compared to a continuum approach. So the categorical approach, it puts people into categories. You either have it or you don't have it. Whereas people can be depressed without having a depressive disorder. And so recognizing that there's a continuum, and that the continuum depends on how much it's impacting you, how much it's impairing you, and that in order for someone to actually be considered to have a mental health disorder, there's actually a large set of criteria that has to be gone over, and they have to be formally assessed for that disorder in order to actually be diagnosed with it.
Well, so picking up on that, people misunderstand, and that was where I was going next. People really misuse the word disorder. Ever since being educated in psychology, it has always really bothered me how somebody who might be particular about something, like maybe they just like a tidy desk or something, and they'll say, "Oh, I'm so OCD," and it's like thinking about it and actually learning what the criteria is for obsessive compulsive disorder. I hold my responses, but my response really should be to educate that person that no, like that's not a disorder. Like maybe they do have it. Like so I guess this would have to be done appropriately, but you actually have to. The issue has to impact your life in a way that your daily living is in some way in some way affected. So it has to cause significant distress or impair your life. Specific with OCD, the obsessions and or compulsions need to take up at least an hour of your time per day. So if it's just the kind of thing that is causing you a little bit of irritation because you notice something's out of place, that's probably not OCD. OCD would obsess over that probably for a significant part of the day. So understanding and not misapplying it inappropriately is important, because in a lot of ways, and relating this all back to stigma, by making those misattributions, we actually diminish what it is. So that it's a really important point to consider. So in the closing few minutes we have, so obviously reducing stigma, mental health stigma, is really important. And as we talked about, there's a lack of awareness, general awareness around mental health, despite how common it is. So there's a component of this that's obviously education, but what else can we do to reduce stigma?
Well, I think it's really important not to judge someone for going to therapy. A lot of people, they have the perspective that if you're going to therapy, then that means you're in crisis and there's some big issue. I think it's better to go to therapy before you get into crisis and before you feel like your life is a big mess, because then it's going to be a lot easier for you to work through things. So when I think of couples therapy, I can kind of think of two categories of people. There's the people who say, well, you don't need therapy unless there's a big issue, and then they wait for everything to fall apart to go to therapy, and then they're on the brink of divorce before they even get into the counseling door. And then there's the other people who think, I want to get the best out of my marriage, and so I'm going to go to counseling to help enhance our marriage. And they come in early before the problem's too big, And they're going to have an easier time working through things because they've come in when the problem is small instead of waiting for it to become a big issue.
Well, and in the same way you're mentioning that that mental health is an aspect of our whole health. So, we don't think twice about going to the doctor for an annual checkup. And so mental health, if it is truly part of our overall health holistically, we need to start really destigmatizing and trying to remove that judgment. And just because somebody seeks help, it's an important point, does not mean that there's a problem. Just because you go to the doctor does not mean you have some serious illness. It might mean that you're maintaining a healthy lifestyle and your overall general health.
Yeah, and a lot of times with these things, you don't know what you don't know. So a lot of times people can come to, the education sessions that I do or something like that, and they don't realize that they didn't have these skills, and when they learn them, it makes a big difference for them.
The other part I wanted to touch on is it's important in an appropriate context to be open with others about our own experiences with mental health. So what I mean by context is if we go around and just openly share the issues we've had with mental health, that may not be the most useful thing to do. But in the context of if we know somebody who is going through specific issues that maybe we know someone who has, or we have gone through similar issues, sharing our experiences and really providing encouragement and support can really make a big difference. So while we talk about this in the public sphere and, destigmatizing sort of the societal narrative about it, a lot of that really begins with our personal interactions and the way that we support others.
Yeah, and I do think the way that in which someone shares their experience is really important. You want to start by having empathy towards what the person is going through and letting them talk about what it is that's happening. So, just saying something like, "Oh, that sucks. That must be so hard." Just acknowledging the struggle that they're going through and letting them get that out, that really is helpful towards the person. And then after you've done that, then saying, you know what, if they're talking about a miscarriage, saying, "I had a miscarriage too. Here's what helped me." Then, once they've received that empathy, then sharing that experience can be really helpful as well.
And the final thing I want to touch on is trying to, as much as you can, disconnect your personal identity from the state of your mental health. Because our mental health isn't who we are, it's what we're going through right now. And so in the same way that if you break your leg, you don't go around and introduce yourself as I'm so-and-so with a broken leg. You can disconnect that identity and focus on the attributes and qualities who make you you. And your mental health is not one of those things.
And this is where what we've talked about before with the cognitive distortion of labeling, how labeling yourself can really cause you to intensify the emotions around a specific issue.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for today. But if you like our content, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. You can follow us on Twitter at IncreMental Tips, like us on Facebook, subscribe on YouTube. As always, let us know in comments what are some areas that you want us to cover. We take viewer feedback very seriously when it comes to making these episodes. Until next time, we upload new content every Tuesday at 11 p.m. Eastern. And remember that small steps can lead to big changes. See you next time.